The olive trees are black shapes against a darker sky. Somewhere behind him, 3 men he trusted with everything have fallen asleep, again, after he asked them, twice, to stay awake with him. He is on his face in the dirt now, not kneeling, down. His sweat falls like something heavier than sweat. In a few hours, soldiers will come through these same trees with torches and a kiss that means betrayal. He knows this. He has known it for days, and in this moment, alone, with nothing left to hold on to, he says one word before he says anything else. Not a title, not a formal address to the God of Israel. A single Aramaic word, the word a grown son used for his father, across a table at the end of a long day. Mark could have translated it. He translates almost everything else. He didn't translate this. Somewhere in the earliest memory of the church, this word survived exactly as Jesus said it, untouched, unedited, carried in its original language into a Greek gospel. The question is why? What was in that word that a translation couldn't hold? To answer that, we have to leave the garden for a moment and go back to the world that shaped the word itself. By the time Jesus is praying in Gethsemane, it's the spring of around 30 AD. Passover week. Jerusalem is swollen with pilgrims, Jews who have traveled from across the empire to be in the city for the feast that remembers a different night, centuries earlier, when death passed over the households that trusted God's instructions. The irony of the timing will matter later. For now, what matters is the world outside the garden wall. Judea is not a free nation. It hasn't been for generations. Rome governs here, not directly through legions in every village, but through a careful, tense arrangement of local rulers and Roman prefects, of whom Pontius Pilate is the name that matters this week. The temple still stands, rebuilt and expanded under Herod the Great into something enormous and gleaming, the center of Jewish religious life. But the priesthood that runs it operates under Rome's watchful permission, not independent from it. Power in Jerusalem this week is a negotiation between 3 parties who don't fully trust each other: the Roman government, the temple authorities, and a population that has not forgotten what it means to be occupied. Jesus has spent the last 3 years moving through this world, not mostly in Jerusalem, but north, in Galilee. Galilee is a different texture of Jewish life: fishing villages, small farming towns, a working population, still thoroughly Jewish, but removed from the political heat of the capital. And Galilee's daily language is not Hebrew. Hebrew is preserved for scripture and prayer, the language of the scrolls read in synagogue, the language spoken in homes, in marketplaces, at dinner tables, between a father and his grown son, is Aramaic. This detail is the hinge the whole story turns on. In an Aramaic household, a father is addressed by his children using a small handful of words depending on formality and closeness, and one of the most common, used across the entire age range, is the word Abba. Not a nursery word reserved for toddlers still learning to talk, a working word used at every stage of a son's life, used by a boy asking for bread, and used by a full-grown man standing at his father's sickbed or across the table at the end of a long day of labor. It carries closeness. It carries familiarity. It is not, however, formal, and that is exactly why it almost never shows up in the way first-century Jews addressed God in prayer. Jewish prayer in this period tends to reach for weight and majesty: Lord, King of the universe, Master of heaven and earth. Even the most personal psalms of trust are dressed in reverence. God is called Father in a handful of places in Israel's scriptures, but almost always to the nation as a whole, or to the king who represents the nation, not to a single person, alone, using the plain word his own children would use for him at dinner. So when a Jewish man, in the middle of the night, alone in an olive grove outside Jerusalem, opens his mouth in prayer and reaches, not for the formal language of the temple, not for Master of heaven and earth, but for the same word a son uses for his father across a table, something unusual is happening in that sentence before we've even translated the rest of it. And Mark, writing this scene down decades later for a Greek-speaking, largely non-Aramaic-speaking audience, makes an editorial choice that is easy to miss and hard to explain away. He doesn't translate it. Let's start with the word itself. because this is where the popular version of this story usually goes wrong. For decades, one of the most repeated claims in Christian teaching has been that Abba essentially means daddy, that it's baby talk, the sound of a toddler reaching up for his father, and that Jesus using it proves he wanted a relationship with God that felt childlike and uncomplicated. This idea comes largely from the work of a 20th century scholar named Joachim Jeremias, whose research on Abba shaped a generation of sermons, devotionals, and Bible studies. It's a beautiful image. It's also, according to later scholarship, not quite accurate. A scholar named James Barr looked closely at how Abba was actually used in surviving Aramaic sources, not just assumed, but documented, and found something different. Grown men used this word. Not only toddlers learning to speak, but adult sons, married sons, sons standing at their father's deathbed. It was familiar, it was personal, but it wasn't baby babble, any more than an adult saying, "Dad" in English is baby babble. Here's the detail worth sitting with. The word Jesus prays in Gethsemane isn't a word that shrinks him. It's a word that reveals his posture. Picture the difference between a small child grabbing a parent's leg because he's frightened and a grown son standing beside his father in a crisis, saying, "Dad, I need you," fully aware of what's happening, fully able to walk away, and choosing to stay anyway. Not a child reaching for comfort. A son declaring where his trust lives, even here. But that raises an immediate problem. If Abba was a normal household word, not shocking, not unheard of, just familiar and intimate, why does it survive as the one Aramaic word Mark refuses to translate into Greek? Ordinary words get translated all the time. Something else has to explain why this one didn't. To answer that, look at what actually happens on the page in Mark chapter 14. Mark writes it like this: "Abba, Father, all things are possible for you. Remove this cup from me. Yet not what I will, but what you will." Two words sit side by side in that sentence, the Aramaic Abba, and immediately after it, the Greek word for father, pater. Mark doesn't choose one or the other. He gives us both, stacked together in the same breath. This is worth slowing down for, because it's easy to read past. Why keep the original word at all if you're going to translate it right afterward anyway? The most reasonable explanation, and the one most scholars land on, is memory. Mark's gospel is widely believed to preserve, through Peter's preaching, some of the earliest and most vivid eyewitness memory in the New Testament. Aramaic was Jesus' language. It's the actual sound he made in that garden. And when something is remembered with that kind of precision, not the idea of what someone said, but the literal sound of it, it tends to survive intact, the way a person might quote a loved one's exact last words rather than paraphrase them. Consider how memory works under grief. People rarely remember a summary of what was said in the hardest moment of their life. They remember the exact words, the exact tone, sometimes even the exact language, if it was different from the one they normally spoke together. This is not a translated phrase. It's a preserved sound. The actual syllables Jesus used, carried word for word into a document written in a completely different language, decades later, for an audience that mostly couldn't have understood a syllable of Aramaic on its own. Mark pays that cost deliberately. He gives his Greek-speaking readers a foreign word, and then explains it, rather than quietly translating and moving on, which tells us something Mark apparently believed was worth the interruption. This was not just what Jesus prayed. This was how he prayed it, and that mattered enough to preserve exactly. But this leaves a harder question sitting untouched. Every other gospel writer covering this same event, Matthew, Luke, had access to the same tradition, the same kind of eyewitness memory running through the early church. And neither of them keeps the word. Set Mark's version next to the others, and the gap becomes obvious. Matthew writes, "My Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me." Luke writes, "Father, if you are willing, remove this cup from me." Both faithful to the moment, both capturing the same posture of submission, neither one keeps the Aramaic. Both go straight to the Greek word for father, the way a translator normally would. Only Mark stops to keep the original sound intact. It's tempting to assume this must be some kind of contradiction, as if one gospel writer remembered something the others forgot, or embellished something the others left plain. That's not really what's happening here. All three writers are describing the same true event, in the same essential words, through the normal freedom ancient biographers had to summarize a scene faithfully, without reproducing it like a court transcript. The content doesn't change, the texture does. And that texture is the detail worth noticing. Mark's Gospel is widely associated by long-standing early church tradition with the preaching of Peter, the very disciple who was there in the garden that night, close enough to hear it, before he fell asleep. If that connection holds any weight, then what we may be looking at in Mark 14:36 isn't just a well-told story. It might be the closest thing we have to an eyewitness's ear for the actual sound of that prayer, preserved by someone who couldn't shake it, even years later, even while dictating to a scribe writing in an entirely different language. Not a detail that changes the theology. A detail that changes the atmosphere. It's the difference between reading, "Jesus prayed to his Father," and standing close enough to hear him say it, in his own voice, in his own language. At the one moment in the Gospels we get to hear him pray like this at all. There's a second question worth pausing on here, one that rarely gets asked out loud. Was this kind of address to God completely without precedent in first-century Judaism, or was Jesus stepping into something that already existed, even faintly? The honest answer is more careful than most sermons make it sound. There's a well-known story preserved in later rabbinic literature about a Jewish holy man named Honi, sometimes called Honi the Circle Drawer, who lived roughly a century before Jesus. In the story, Honi prays boldly for rain during a drought, and the tradition compares his confidence before God to a son who makes persistent demands of his own father. That comparison shows up in the Mishnah, the earliest layer of rabbinic writing, compiled generations after Jesus, and expanded further in later commentary. This detail matters, for honesty's sake. It means the idea of approaching God with the confidence of a son wasn't entirely without any precedent in Jewish religious imagination. Scholars differ on how much weight to put on this parallel. It's a different language, a different literary form, recorded well after the fact, and it isn't quoting God being addressed directly as Abba in personal prayer the way Jesus does in the garden. But it does complicate any claim that Jesus' use of the word came from absolutely nowhere. The truer picture isn't unprecedented, it's rare, and taken further here than almost anywhere else on record, which actually sharpens the question rather than answering it. If the idea of son-like boldness before God wasn't entirely unheard of, why does this particular moment, this particular word, in this particular prayer, carry so much weight in how the earliest church remembered Jesus? Part of the answer sits further back in Israel's own scriptures, in how rarely this kind of language gets used at all. Open the Hebrew Bible looking specifically for a single person, praying alone, personally addressing God as Father, and the search comes up nearly empty. God is called Father in a real sense, but almost always corporately. Israel as a whole is called God's Son, brought out of Egypt like a father carrying a child. Out of Egypt I called my son, God says through the prophet Hosea, looking back at the Exodus. Earlier still, in the book of Exodus, God instructs Moses to tell Pharaoh, "Israel is my firstborn son." Later, the promise to David's royal line uses the same family language for the king specifically. "I will be to him a father, and he shall be to me a son," God tells David through the prophet Nathan, establishing the covenant that would run through Israel's kings. Notice the pattern. Father language for God shows up for the nation as a whole. It shows up for the king who represents the nation. It essentially does not show up for an ordinary individual, alone, addressing God personally and informally in prayer. That's the quiet, unremarked-on backdrop for what happens in Gethsemane. A son of Israel, praying alone, at night, uses not the corporate, formal, covenantal father language of the nation and its king, but the small, plain, household word of an individual family. He collapses the distance between the largest possible category of biblical sonship and the smallest, most personal one, and he does it in the same breath as asking to be spared what's coming. Not a title borrowed from Israel's national story, a word borrowed from his own dinner table and handed directly to God. If you've never noticed that detail before, that one gospel writer chose to keep the actual sound of Jesus' voice instead of quietly translating it away, and that the word itself sits almost alone in how personally Israel's scriptures ever let anyone address God this way, you're starting to read these accounts the way they were meant to be read, not as four identical copies of the same event, but as four witnesses, each preserving something slightly different about the same true night. If this kind of close reading is doing something for you, this is exactly the kind of work this channel exists to do, so it's worth subscribing if you want more of it. And if there's a detail here you'd never caught before, say so in the comments. It helps shape where we dig next. Because there's a detail we haven't touched yet, and it's the one that makes this whole prayer harder to sit with, not easier. We've been looking at the word Jesus used. We haven't yet looked closely at what he used it for. Abba, Father, all things are possible for you. That's not a neutral opening line. That's a son reminding his father exactly what he believes about him, right before asking for something specific, something Jesus already seems to know he isn't going to get. Look at the shape of the sentence that follows. Remove this cup from me. In the Hebrew scriptures, a cup is a recurring image for what a person is given to endure, sometimes blessing, more often, in prophetic language, judgment or suffering poured out and drunk to the bottom. Jesus has already used this image earlier in the Gospels, and he uses it again here, asking, plainly, for it to be taken away. There's no performance of calm in that request, no forced acceptance, just a son telling his father, using the most familiar word available to him, what he actually wants. And then, without waiting for an answer, the sentence turns, yet not what I will, but what you will. That single word, yet, carries enormous weight for something so small. It marks the exact hinge between a real, honest request and a complete surrender to whatever the answer turns out to be. Jesus doesn't pretend not to want the cup removed, and he doesn't let that honest desire become the final word. Both things are true in the same breath, back to back, with nothing to soften the transition between them. This pattern, real request followed by full surrender, isn't isolated to this one prayer. It's the same shape found in the prayer Jesus taught his disciples earlier, when he told them to pray, "Your will be done, on earth as it is in heaven." Most scholars believe that the Greek word for Father in that prayer likely echoes the same underlying Aramaic address Jesus used everywhere else in his teaching and prayer life. Though it's worth being honest that the gospel text itself, in Matthew and Luke, records it in Greek, not Aramaic, so this connection is a reasonable inference rather than something the text states outright. What can be said with more confidence is the pattern itself. Intimate address to the Father, immediately followed by surrender to his will, shows up both in the prayer Jesus taught his followers to pray every day and in the one prayer of his own that the Gospels let us overhear in full. There's a further thread worth naming carefully here, from a letter written later, most likely to Jewish believers grappling with what it meant that their Messiah suffered at all. The book of Hebrews describes Jesus, in the days of his earthly life, offering up prayers and supplications, with loud cries and tears, to him who was able to save him from death, and adds that he learned obedience through what he suffered. The passage doesn't use the word Abba, and it doesn't name Gethsemane specifically, though most readers of the letter, both ancient and modern, have naturally connected it to that night. What it confirms, carefully, is that the raw, tearful honesty of that prayer in the garden fits a broader New Testament portrait of a son who submitted to God not by feeling nothing, but by feeling everything and yielding anyway. Put plainly, this word Abba was never a word that removed the weight of what Jesus was carrying. It was the word he used while carrying it, which brings the story to its widest turn. because this word didn't stay in the garden. It didn't stay locked inside one night, one prayer, one gospel. It reappears, years later, in the mouths of people who never met Jesus, never heard his voice, never stood anywhere near that grove of trees outside Jerusalem. Turn to Paul's letters, written years after Gethsemane, to churches in Rome and in Galatia, most of whose members had never set foot in Judea, never heard Aramaic spoken in daily life, never once stood near an olive tree outside the city walls. In Romans chapter 8, Paul writes that believers have received the spirit of adoption as sons, by whom we cry, Abba, Father. In Galatians chapter 4, writing to a completely different church, in a different region, facing different problems, he uses the exact same phrase again. God has sent the Spirit of His Son into our hearts, crying, Abba, Father. Look closely at what's actually happening in both verses. Paul isn't simply telling Greek-speaking believers that they can now call God Father. He could have written the Greek word pater and stopped there. That would have been more than enough for his audience to understand. Instead, in both letters, to two different churches, he reaches back for the same two words, in the same order, in the same combination. Aramaic first, Greek translation immediately after. Abba, ho pater. That is the exact verbal pattern Mark uses to record Jesus' own prayer in Gethsemane. Sit with that for a moment, because it's easy to read past. Paul is not handing Roman and Galatian Christians a new word for prayer. He is placing their prayer inside Jesus' prayer, using the identical foreign syllables Jesus used in the one moment the Gospels let us hear him pray aloud in his darkest hour, and putting those same syllables into the mouths of ordinary believers who never knew him in the flesh. The wording connection is well attested. The phrase is too specific, appearing twice in two unrelated letters, to be a coincidence. What is genuinely debated among scholars is exactly how consciously Paul intended to evoke Gethsemane by name, versus this already being an early, treasured prayer formula circulating in the church's worship life before Paul ever picked up a pen. Either explanation still points to the same conclusion. The earliest church did not simply borrow Jesus' vocabulary for God. In some real sense, it borrowed his voice. There's a piece of first-century background that makes Paul's word choice even more specific than it first appears. Paul doesn't only use the word Abba in these two passages. He pairs it with a particular Greek legal term, huiothesia, usually translated adoption. It's a real word from Roman social and legal life, describing a formal, binding legal process, well documented across the Greco-Roman world, in which a person was fully and permanently placed into a new family, as a legitimate heir, with old debts and old obligations erased, and full inheritance rights granted going forward. For churches living inside Roman cities and Roman provinces, Rome itself, and Galatia, a Roman province, this wasn't an abstract metaphor, it was a recognizable legal category from their own world. Paul is not simply saying believers feel close to God. He's saying something more specific, and honestly, more durable than a feeling. He's saying they have undergone a real change of legal standing, moved permanently from outsider to heir, and the proof word for that new status, the word that comes out when the reality of it finally lands on a person's heart, is the same word Jesus prayed in Gethsemane, in the hour it cost him the most. And 2 verses later, in Romans, Paul closes this loop directly, in a line easy to skip past on a fast reading. Those who cry Abba, he writes, are fellow heirs with Christ, provided we suffer with him. Not provided we feel close to him. Provided we suffer with him. The word was never a comfort word, sealed off from cost. It was a trust word, first prayed by a son who was about to be crushed doing his Father's will, and then handed to everyone who would ever pray it after him, not as an escape from the cost of following God, but as the very sound trust makes while standing inside that cost. So look at the whole shape of it now, all at once. A garden, nighttime, olive trees standing black against the sky, 3 friends asleep, again, nearby, a son on his face in the dirt, hours from betrayal, Hours from a cross he has already seen coming. And in that moment, the worst moment, he doesn't reach for a title. He doesn't reach for the formal language of the temple, the language of kings and priests and burnt offerings. He reaches for a table word, a household word, the word a grown son uses for his father at the end of a long day, at a wedding, at a deathbed, not a child's cry, but a son's address. Abba. One gospel writer keeps it, just one, not because the others got it wrong, but because this one carried something the others chose to translate away, a sound so precise, so specific, so remembered, that changing it into Greek would have lost something true about the night it happened. And then, years later, in cities that never heard Jesus pray, in languages that were never his own, believers who had no memory of that garden opened their mouths and said the same two words, in the same order, that he said, Abba, ho pater. Not a phrase they invented, a phrase they inherited. The word was never about comfort, it was never about being small enough to be carried. It was about a son who trusted his father enough to ask for the cup to be removed, and trusted him enough to stay when it wasn't. That's the word Mark refused to translate. That's the word Paul refused to let go of. That's the word underneath the word Father, every time it's prayed since. Not a child's cry, a grown son's declaration, spoken once, in the dark, at the exact moment trust cost him everything. Most people never pray Abba from a garden. Most people pray it from somewhere smaller, a hospital hallway, a quiet car, the edge of a bed at 2 a.m, but the shape of the moment is often the same. There's something you've asked God to remove, and it hasn't been removed. That's the part of this story easiest to walk past. Jesus asked, plainly, honestly, without pretending he didn't want a different outcome. Remove this cup from me. No performance of acceptance, no forced calm. Just a son telling his father, in the most familiar word he had, what he actually wanted. And the cup didn't move. Most people know what it feels like to pray that way and hear silence, or hear an answer they didn't want. It's a strange, disorienting kind of faith, the kind that has to keep believing all things are possible for you in the same breath as watching the hard thing happen anyway. It's easy to assume real trust would have changed the outcome. Jesus' prayer suggests otherwise. His trust didn't move the cup, it moved him, toward it, not away from it. That's the part worth sitting with quietly, without rushing to a lesson. This word, Abba, was never a guarantee that the hard thing gets removed. It was a declaration of whose hands it stays in either way. The intimacy didn't cancel the suffering, it went with him into it. Maybe that's closer to most people's actual lives than the version of this word usually preached. Not a God who removes every cup on request, a father close enough to be addressed like one. Even, and maybe especially, in the nights nothing gets resolved. He didn't ask his father to feel close. He asked his father to remove the cup, and stayed anyway. That's what Abba actually costs. If you've never read this prayer the same way again after tonight, that's what this channel is for. Slow, honest looks at the words we've said 1,000 times without ever really hearing them. If this study opened something up for you, subscribe to the Scripture Project and send it to someone who's ever prayed for a cup to be removed and heard nothing back. That's who this one's for.